The night air cut through Olivia Reed's tattered coat like a blade, its merciless chill seeping into her bones. She sat against the rough brick wall of an alley, her arms wrapped tightly around her two daughters, Ella and Sophie, who lay curled in her lap beneath a threadbare blanket. Their tiny bodies trembled against her, their soft breaths barely audible above the distant hum of city life, car horns blaring, hurried footsteps tapping against the pavement, the occasional murmur of people passing by. But none of them stopped. None of them noticed her. Olivia Reed had learned long ago that people preferred to look away from suffering rather than acknowledge it. Her body ached with exhaustion, her stomach twisted with hunger. But she ignored it. Survival had become second nature, an instinct she had honed over the years since life had torn everything away from her. She had once dreamed of a future filled with love, stability, and laughter, but those dreams had been shattered long ago. Now, there was only this endless fight to keep her daughters warm, fed, and safe. She could bear the hunger, the pain, the exhaustion, but what she couldn't bear was the look in Ella's eyes when she whispered the question Olivia never had a good answer for. "Mommy, why is it always so cold?" Her daughter's voice was small, barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of their suffering. Olivia forced a smile, reaching up to brush a few strands of blonde hair from Ella's face. "Because winter is here, sweetheart," she said, keeping her voice light, as if it were a normal conversation and not one that clawed at her soul. "But you know what that means? We get to snuggle even closer. And that's the best part, isn't it?" Ella's bright blue eyes, once full of wonder and mischief, searched Olivia's face for reassurance before nodding. "Yeah," she murmured, though there was no real conviction behind it. Sophie, still half asleep, clung to her mother's waist, pressing her small fingers into the fabric of Olivia's coat. "I don't like the cold," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. "I want to go home." Olivia's breath caught in her throat. Home. The word felt foreign now. Distant. It had once meant warmth, security, a place where laughter echoed through the halls. Now, it was just a dream, a whisper of something she had lost. She swallowed the lump in her throat and forced herself to stay strong for them. "We have each other," she said softly, pressing a kiss to Sophie's temple. "That's what makes anywhere we go a home." Sophie lifted her head, blinking sleepily. "Do you think we'll have a house again? Like the ones with big windows and warm beds?" Olivia hesitated. She had nothing to give them but words. But words were important. Words were hope. And without hope, there was nothing. "Yes, my love," she promised, though she had no idea how or when. "One day, we will." She tightened her grip on them, trying to shield them from the wind as best as she could. Her stomach growled, a sharp reminder that she had gone another night without food. She had given the girls the last of the stale sandwich she had managed to get earlier that day from a kind stranger. A rare gesture of generosity in a world that mostly pretended not to see them. The city moved on, indifferent, while she sat in the shadows. Invisible. The streets had become her reality. An unforgiving teacher that had shown her how cruel the world could be. She had learned to read people, to sense who might spare a coin and who would cross the street to avoid her. There were those who glanced her way with pity, and others with disgust, muttering words under their breath. Words that stung more than the cold ever could. She probably did this to herself. People like her just don't try hard enough. If only they knew. If only they understood that she hadn't chosen this life. That one mistake, one moment of misplaced trust, had unraveled everything. That she had fought, begged, clawed to keep herself and her daughters from slipping through the cracks. Only to be met with closed doors and empty hands. Ella stirred against her, her small voice pulling Olivia from her thoughts. "Mommy?" "Yes, sweetheart? Why do people walk past us like they don't see us?" Olivia's throat tightened. How could she explain to her daughter that the world turned away from suffering because it was easier to pretend it didn't exist? That people didn't want to acknowledge pain they couldn't, or wouldn't, fix. "They're busy," she said finally, keeping her voice gentle. "Sometimes people don't stop because they're rushing to work or to their families." Ella frowned. "But we're people too." Olivia smiled, brushing her fingers through her daughter's tangled hair. "Yes, my love, and the right people, the ones with kind hearts, will see us. They will help us when we need it most." Sophie nestled closer, sighing softly. "I just wish Daddy was here." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Olivia kept her expression neutral, even as her heart clenched. I know, baby, she whispered. Do you think he ever thinks about us? Ella asked, her voice so innocent, so full of hope that it nearly broke Olivia. She hesitated, then kissed the top of Ella's head. I don't know, sweetheart, but what I do know is that you have me. And I will never leave you. They didn't say anything after that. Maybe they understood the truth that Olivia could never bring herself to say out loud, that their father had left before they were born. Vanishing without a word, that they had been nothing more than an inconvenience to him. A sharp gust of wind whipped through the alley, and Sophie whimpered, pressing her face into Olivia's side. Olivia quickly wrapped her arms tighter around them. Close your eyes, my loves. I'll keep you warm. Sophie buried her face in her mother's coat, while Ella held on tightly. Mommy? Yes, baby? Will things ever get better? Olivia closed her eyes, pressing a lingering kiss to Ella's forehead. She wanted to believe the answer was yes. She had to believe it, because if she didn't, what else was there? Yes, my love, she whispered. They will, I promise. She had no idea how she would keep that promise. But she had to. For them, the city was alive with movement. A never-ending stream of cars and people, their hurried footsteps echoing against the wet pavement. In a black luxury sedan, parked at a red light, James Weston sat in the backseat, his fingers absently tapping against the polished leather armrest. His driver remained motionless, staring ahead, used to the long waits, the unbearable traffic, the way the city pulsed with restless energy. James, however, barely noticed the congestion. His mind was elsewhere, lost in the exhaustion of another endless day spent in boardrooms and high-rise offices. Closing deals that made numbers soar but left his life feeling emptier with each passing moment. He sighed, loosening his ties slightly. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him like a leaden blanket. Suffocating, inescapable. It had been years, years of building an empire, of ensuring his name meant something in the world of wealth and power. And yet, at times like these, as he stared out the tinted window, watching life rush past him, he felt like a stranger in his own existence. Then he saw her. At first, she was just another face in the crowd, just another struggling mother huddled against the cold with her children. A sight he had become shamefully accustomed to ignoring. The world was filled with suffering, and people in his position were trained to look past it, to move forward without stopping. But something about her made his breath hitch. Something familiar. James leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowing. The dim glow of a street lamp illuminated the woman's face for just a moment. And time itself seemed to shatter around him. No, it wasn't possible. But then he saw the rain. A silver band, small and unassuming, glinting against the pale light, the very same one he had given to the woman he had once loved. The woman he had left behind without a second thought, believing it was for the best. Olivia. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the hum of traffic, the distant honking of impatient drivers. It couldn't be her. It shouldn't be her. The Olivia he had known was full of life. A girl who had laughed under the summer sky and whispered dreams of forever into the darkness. She had been warm and wild, reckless and radiant, nothing like the hollowed-out shell of a woman now clutching two sleeping children against her frail body. James's grip tightened around the door handle. He felt an unfamiliar weight pressing against his chest. Guilt. Maybe. Or something worse. Something far more painful. Regret. Sir? The driver's voice barely registered. The light's green. James didn't move. He couldn't. His world had just cracked open. The past colliding with the present in a way he had never imagined. The years that separated them collapsed in an instant. And all he could see, all he could hear, was the ghost of the girl he had loved, the one he had abandoned. He could have looked away. He could have let the car roll forward. Let the past stay buried where he had left it. But he didn't. Instead, he pushed open the door and stepped out into the night. Olivia barely registered the movement. Her focus was on her daughters, ensuring they were warm enough, safe enough. As she adjusted the threadbare blanket over them, she had grown accustomed to people walking past without a second glance. Learned to tune out the occasional whispers of disgust, the looks of pity that never led to action. She had become invisible, a shadow against the cityscape. Just another story the world refused to read. But when she felt the shift in the air, when she sensed someone standing too close, lingering in a way that made her instincts bristle, she looked up. and the breath left her lungs. For a moment, she thought she was imagining it, that her exhaustion had finally warped reality into something crueler than it already was. James Weston. His name slammed into her mind with the force of a wrecking ball, knocking loose memories she had spent years trying to bury. The sharp cut of his jawline, the deep-set blue eyes that had once held promises she had foolishly believed, the tailored suit that clung to him like a second skin, all of it was heartbreakingly familiar. But the man before her wasn't the same. And neither was she. Her fingers instinctively tightened around her daughters, pulling them closer, shielding them as if he were a threat rather than a memory. James took a step forward, his expression unreadable, but Olivia flinched, her body tensing as if bracing for impact. "It's you," he murmured, almost to himself, his voice carrying something she couldn't quite name. Disbelief, maybe, or something deeper. Olivia's breath came in short, shallow bursts. She wanted to move, wanted to disappear into the night before he could say anything else, before he could unravel everything she had fought to protect. But her body wouldn't listen. "You," James started, but he stopped, his throat working around words that refused to form. She had imagined this moment before, late at night when sleep evaded her, the fantasy of him returning, of him realizing what he had done, of him falling to his knees and begging for forgiveness. But now, standing here, with his gaze burning into hers, she felt nothing but ice spreading through her veins. Because it was too late. Because he had already left her behind once. And she would never, never, let him do it again. "I have to go," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but firm, unyielding. James's eyes flickered with something, panic, maybe, or regret so strong it threatened to swallow him whole. "Olivia, wait." But she was already turning, already pulling her daughters into the shadows, her heart hammering, her pulse roaring in her ears. James watched her disappear into the night, his chest constricting so tightly he could barely breathe. He had spent a lifetime believing he had made the right choice, that walking away had been necessary, inevitable. But now, as he stood frozen in place, watching the only woman he had ever truly loved retreat into a darkness he had helped create, he realized the bitter truth. He had been wrong. He had been so wrong. And he would do anything, to make it right. But as Olivia vanished into the depths of the city, one undeniable fact settled into James's bones. She didn't need him anymore. And that terrified him more than anything ever had. To find out what happens next, if James can right his wrongs. If Olivia will ever let him back into her life. If love is truly stronger than the scars of the past. Stay with us until the very end of this story. Because some ghosts don't stay buried forever. And sometimes, second chances come when we least expect them. The bitter wind bit at Olivia Reed's skin as she trudged through the wet streets, clutching her daughter's tiny hands as if letting go would mean losing them forever. Her feet ached, her body begged for rest. But she had long since learned that comfort was a luxury she could not afford. The encounter with James had left her shaken, her pulse still uneven from the sheer force of it. She had spent years preparing for this moment, rehearsing what she would say if fate ever forced them to cross paths again. She had imagined spitting venom, telling him exactly what he had done to her, how his abandonment had nearly destroyed her. But when she had seen him standing there, looking at her like she was the past he never thought he'd have to face, all the words had died in her throat, because she had already spent too many years screaming into silence. Her only focus now was her daughters. They were all that mattered. "Mommy, my feet hurt," Sophie whimpered, her tiny voice barely audible over the distant city noise. Olivia swallowed the lump in her throat and forced a smile. "I know, baby," she said softly, tightening her grip. "We just have to keep going a little longer." She knew how much longer, a little longer, meant. It meant until she found another alley or a covered bus stop to rest under. It meant until she scraped together enough coins for a meal. Or until a kind stranger left behind a half-eaten sandwich. It meant until the next sunrise. And then the next. And then the next. Ella sniffled, rubbing her arms as she clung to her mother's side. "Can't we just go back to where we were?" she asked, her voice laced with exhaustion. Olivia shook her head. They had stayed in that alley for too long. She knew what happened when you became too familiar. Too predictable. The police had already come by earlier, ordering her to move along as if she were litter on the street. The manager of the bakery next door had given her a look that had spoken volumes. Don't come back tomorrow. They were running out of places to go. She had tried the shelters. But space was limited, and families like hers were never the priority. More than once, she had stood in line for hours only to be turned away at the last minute. Forced to tell her daughters that they would have to sleep outside again. And yet, they still trusted her. They still looked up at her with those big, hopeful eyes, believing she would keep them safe. Even though she knew, deep down, that she was barely holding on. She could feel the hunger gnawing at her insides. A dull, constant ache that she had long since learned to ignore. She had become a master at rationing food, saving the smallest scraps for Ella and Sophie. Even when her own body screamed for sustenance, she had gotten used to the ache of emptiness in her stomach. Just as she had gotten used to the sting of rejection, the shame of being looked at like she was nothing. But the girls, they were still too young to understand. And she prayed they never would. The cold pressed in on her, seeping through the layers of fabric that did little to protect her. She knew they couldn't last another night like this. She had to find somewhere warm, somewhere safe. And then, as if the universe had heard her silent plea, a black luxury sedan pulled up to the curb ahead of them. She knew the car before she even saw him step out. Her body went rigid as James Weston emerged, his broad frame silhouetted against the streetlights. He looked different now, older, sharper, his once boyish features hardened by time. His suit was tailored to perfection, his shoes polished, his hair neatly styled, as if he had stepped out of a world completely separate from hers. Because he had never belonged to the world of hunger and cold, of sleepless nights spent curled against her daughters in alleyways. He had never needed. And yet, here he was. Olivia, he said, his voice raw, like he was tasting her name for the first time in years. She didn't respond. She simply stared at him, gripping her daughter's hands tighter, willing herself to disappear into the night. James took a hesitant step forward. He looked at her, really looked at her, and something in his face shifted. His gaze flickered to the girls. Their small, shivering bodies pressed against her sides. His jaw tightened, his breath turning shallow. Get in the car, he said quietly. She let out a sharp breath, shaking her head. No, Olivia, no, she couldn't, she wouldn't. Not after everything. Not after the years of pain, of struggling, of learning how to survive without him. James ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. He had spent years making decisions that benefited only himself. Ones that made him wealthier, more powerful. But standing here now, looking at the woman he had once loved, the woman who was now a mother, desperate to protect her children, he felt like he had failed at the one thing that had ever truly mattered. He had left her, and now, because of him, she was here, in the cold, alone. He couldn't live with that. Please, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Olivia wanted to refuse again. She wanted to turn her back on him the way he had once turned his back on her. But then Ella's small voice broke the silence. Mommy, I'm so cold. That was it. That was the moment Olivia felt herself break. Because this wasn't about her. This wasn't about pride or pain or the wounds James had left behind. This was about them, her daughters, her babies. And she would do anything, anything, for them. Even if it meant stepping back into the past she had spent years trying to escape. Slowly, hesitantly, she nodded. James let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He stepped forward, reaching to take Sophie from her arms. But Olivia recoiled instinctively. His face fell, but he understood. Trust wasn't something he could ask for. It was something he would have to earn. Wordlessly, he opened the car door, stepping aside as Olivia gently guided the girls into the warmth of the vehicle. They let out small gasps as the heat wrapped around them, their tiny fingers stretching toward the vents like they had never felt warmth before. James felt something inside him crack. This should have never been their reality. And it was his fault that it was. Finally, Olivia slid into the seat beside them, her posture stiff, her fingers trembling as she pulled the door shut. James climbed into the front, instructing the driver to head to his estate. Silence filled the car. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't familiar. But it was something. James turned slightly, stealing a glance at Olivia in the rearview mirror. She was staring out the window, her expression unreadable, but her hand rested on Sophie's back, her fingers stroking gently. as if to reassure herself that this was real. That for the first time in years. Her daughters were warm, safe. James knew that tonight was only the beginning. That there was still a lifetime of wounds between them. That Olivia may never forgive him. But he also knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would never leave her again. No matter what it took. No matter what it cost. He had lost her once. And he would spend the rest of his life making sure he never lost her again. The silence in the car was suffocating. The only sound was the soft breathing of Olivia's daughters. Their small bodies finally warm after too many nights spent shivering under a thin blanket. James Weston's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. His knuckles turning white. He had spent the entire drive trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand how the woman he had once loved, the woman he had left behind, had ended up like this. He stole another glance in the rearview mirror. Olivia sat rigidly, her posture stiff, her gaze fixed out the window as if she were counting every streetlight, memorizing every turn, preparing to run at the first opportunity. She didn't trust him. He couldn't blame her. His stomach twisted. She was still wearing the ring. Even after all these years. Even after everything. James swallowed hard, turning his attention back to the road. He had been given a second chance, a chance to make things right. And he wasn't going to waste it. The mansion loomed ahead, its towering iron gates parting as the car approached. The estate was a stark contrast to the streets Olivia had been surviving on. The sprawling landscape a world away from the unforgiving pavement she had walked with her daughters in tow. But as the car rolled to a stop in the grand driveway, he felt the weight of something heavy pressing against his chest. This wasn't going to be easy. James stepped out first, rounding the car to open the door for her. Olivia hesitated before sliding out, keeping her daughters close. Their wide eyes scanned the unfamiliar surroundings, their expressions a mixture of awe and uncertainty. Ella tugged at Olivia's coat. "Mommy, is this a castle?" James almost smiled, but Olivia's fingers clenched at her daughter's hand. She wasn't awed. She was overwhelmed. She had spent years surviving in a world that wanted nothing to do with her. And now, she was standing in front of something so grand, so unreachable, that it felt like another cruel joke. She turned to him, her voice low. "Why are we here, James?" His throat tightened. "Because you have nowhere else to go. Because I owe you more than an apology. Because I can't stand the thought of you sleeping on the streets one more night." Instead, he simply said, "Because you're not alone anymore." A flicker of something passed through her eyes, doubt, hesitation, maybe even hope, but she quickly buried it. She didn't believe him. Not yet. He stepped back, motioning toward the grand entrance. "Come inside. The girls need rest." Another pause. Another moment where he feared she would refuse. But then Sophie yawned, rubbing her tired eyes, and Olivia exhaled shakily, nodding. They followed him inside. The warmth of the mansion wrapped around them instantly. A stark contrast to the brutal cold outside. The grand chandelier cast a soft glow over the polished floors. The scent of freshly brewed tea drifting from the kitchen. James had never thought twice about the luxuries he lived with. But now, watching Olivia's shoulders tense as if the very walls might close in on her, he realized just how foreign this world was to her. She didn't belong here. Or at least, she didn't think she did. He wanted to change that. A small, older woman in a crisp uniform approached them, her eyes widening slightly as she took in the newcomers. "Mr. Weston, prepare a guest room," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "One big enough for Olivia and the girls." The woman nodded and hurried off, but not before stealing another curious glance at Olivia. James turned back to her. "Let me show you where you'll be staying." She hesitated again. Then, with a protective arm around her daughters, she followed. The guest suite was bigger than anything Olivia had ever known. The bed alone looked like it could swallow them whole. The fireplace crackled softly, the thick, plush carpet cushioning her tired feet. It felt surreal. Too surreal. She stood frozen in the doorway, watching as James bent down to tuck a blanket around Sophie, who had already curled up on the couch. Ella was fighting sleep, her tiny fists rubbing at her eyes. James looked up, catching Olivia's stare. "What is it?" he asked softly. Her throat felt tight. This is too much." His brows furrowed. "Olivia, I don't belong here," she whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't my world." A beat of silence. Then, James stood, stepping toward her. "You don't have to belong to it," he said, "but that doesn't mean you don't deserve to be safe." She swallowed hard, wrapping her arms around herself. "Nothing in my life has ever been permanent, James. Not a home, not food, not even the kindness of strangers." Her voice wavered. "So forgive me if I don't believe that this," she gestured around the room, "is going to last." James's jaw tightened. He had done this. He had turned her into someone who couldn't accept help without bracing for it to be ripped away. He took another step closer, lowering his voice. "It will last as long as you let it." She blinked, caught off guard by the intensity in his gaze. He wasn't just saying words. He meant it. For the first time in years. Someone meant it. Her heart pounded, but before she could respond, Ella tugged on her sleeve. "Mommy?" Olivia looked down. Ella hesitated, then glanced up at James before whispering, "Is he going to make us leave?" The question shattered him. James bent down so he was eye level with the little girl, his heart squeezing in his chest. "No," he said firmly. "You're safe here." Ella studied him carefully. "Even if we don't belong?" James swallowed the lump in his throat. "Especially then." Ella stared at him a moment longer. Then, as if satisfied with his answer, climbed onto the bed beside Sophie. Within minutes, both girls were asleep, but Olivia was still standing there, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold herself together. James hesitated, then reached out, slowly, carefully. His fingers brushed against her wrist. She flinched. He pulled back immediately, cursing himself. "I won't hurt you," he murmured. She exhaled sharply, running a hand through her hair. "It's not that." "Then what?" She turned to him, her eyes shining with something he couldn't quite place. "I don't know how to accept this," she admitted. "I don't know how to trust it." James felt something twist inside him. She wasn't rejecting him. She was just scared. And that was worse. "You don't have to trust it yet," he said quietly. "Just let it be." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then, finally, she nodded. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for now, that was enough. That night, James sat in his study, staring at the ceiling. He had spent years convincing himself that walking away from Olivia had been the right choice, that it had been for the best. But now, with her and the girls sleeping just down the hall, he knew the truth. He had made the worst mistake of his life, and he would spend every day making up for it. He wasn't going to let them go. Not again. Not ever. Do you think Olivia will be able to trust James again? Can he make up for the years he abandoned her? Let us know in the comments. Comment below. What would you do in Olivia's situation? Would you accept help or keep running? Like this story? Give it a thumbs up to support Olivia and her daughters. Subscribe for more emotional, heart-touching stories like this. Because sometimes, second chances don't come twice. The night was still, too still. Olivia Reed had spent enough time on the streets to know when something wasn't right. Even in the safety of the Grand Weston estate, surrounded by warmth and comfort she had never known before, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. The sensation crawled over her skin, an old instinct warning her that trouble was near. She wrapped her arms around herself, standing by the window of the guest suite James had given her. The view stretched out over the city, twinkling lights reflecting off the glass. To anyone else, it would have looked peaceful. But to Olivia, it felt like a trap, like she was standing in the eye of a storm that had yet to break. A soft murmur stirred behind her. She turned to see Ella and Sophie curled up in the massive bed, lost in sleep, their small fingers clutched together. They looked so peaceful, so innocent. They didn't know how cruel the world could be. Olivia had fought for years to keep them from the worst of it, to shield them from the hunger, the fear, the pain of knowing they had no one but her. And yet, no matter how hard she fought, the past had found her again. She exhaled shakily, pressing her fingers against the cool glass. She wanted to believe James when he said they were safe. She wanted to trust him when he promised that she didn't have to fight anymore. But trust was dangerous, and she had learned the hard way that safety was never permanent. A knock at the door made her jump. She turned sharply, her heart hammering in her chest. For a moment, her mind flashed to the worst possibilities: police, social workers, someone here to take her daughters away. But when she hesitated and the knock came again, softer this time, she exhaled and crossed the room. She cracked the door open. James stood there, his hands shoved into his pockets, his face unreadable. "Hey," he said quietly. She swallowed, gripping the edge of the door. "Hey." His gaze flickered past her to the girls before settling back on her. "Can we talk?" She hesitated, but then she nodded, stepping back to let him in. James walked in slowly, his presence filling the room. He looked around, taking in the suitcases he had bought for her. The fresh clothes neatly folded on the dresser, things she still hadn't touched. As if accepting them meant accepting this was real. Finally, he turned back to her. "I got a letter today," he said. The hairs on her arms stood up. "What kind of letter?" she asked, her voice careful. James reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He handed it to her without a word. Olivia unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words. "Stay away from her. Stay away from her children. You don't know who you're dealing with." Her stomach dropped. She read it again, her breath growing shallow, her pulse roaring in her ears. The handwriting was neat, precise, like someone had taken their time crafting the threat. She squeezed the paper in her trembling fingers. No name, no signature. But she knew. She knew. "Ryan." James studied her carefully. "Olivia," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Who would send this?" She inhaled sharply, her hands clenching into fists. The room suddenly felt too small, too suffocating. She wanted to pretend she didn't know. She wanted to believe that she could stay hidden in this new life James had given her. That the past wouldn't come knocking. But it already had. She forced herself to meet his eyes. "It's him." James frowned. "Who?" Her throat tightened. Saying his name felt like summoning a demon. But she had no choice. "Ryan," she whispered. James went completely still. She turned away, her arms wrapping around herself, her body trembling. "He never wanted them," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I told him I was pregnant, he laughed. He said I was ruining his life. That I was a mistake." James's jaw clenched, his hands curled into fists at his sides. She let out a shaky breath, her nails digging into her arms. "He left, and I thought I was free of him. I thought," she choked on the words, blinking back the sting of tears. "I thought he would forget about us." James took a slow step closer. But he didn't. She shook her head. "Men like Ryan don't just forget. They wait. They watch." She swallowed hard. "And when they decide they want something, they take it." The silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. James finally exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "He's not taking anything from you, Olivia." She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "You don't know him, James. You don't know what he's capable of." James stepped closer. "Then tell me." She turned to him, her eyes burning with something raw, something desperate. "I don't need you to fight my battles for me." His expression softened. "I'm not trying to." She let out a sharp breath. "Then what are you doing?" His voice was quiet when he answered. "I'm trying to protect you." She swallowed. She wanted to believe him. But she had spent too long surviving on her own to trust that anyone would ever stay. She glanced down at the letter, her fingers tightening around the paper. The words blurred, the warning sinking deep into her bones. Stay away from her children. Ryan wanted them. He didn't care about them. But he wanted them. James suddenly reached out, gently prying the letter from her grip. "He doesn't control this, Olivia," he said firmly. "You do." She met his eyes, her breath unsteady. And then, for the first time in years, she whispered the words that had haunted her every waking moment. "I'm scared." James's gaze softened. Without thinking, he reached out, taking her trembling hands in his. "I know," he murmured, "but you're not alone anymore." She swallowed hard. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. But deep down, she knew, this wasn't over. Not yet. Not even close. The air inside the Weston estate felt suffocating. Despite the warmth that filled the room, Olivia Reed sat on the edge of the massive bed, her hands trembling as she stared at the crumpled letter in her lap. The words were burned into her mind, looping over and over again like a cruel melody. "Stay away from her. Stay away from her children. You don't know who you're dealing with." Her heart pounded in her chest, the same way it had all those years ago when Ryan had first shown her who he truly was. She had been so young then, so naive, believing in love, believing in promises that had been as fragile as the life growing inside her. She had begged him to stay. She had begged him to care. And he had laughed in her face. Now, after years of silence, After she had done everything in her power to keep herself and her daughters hidden from him, he had returned like a ghost, dragging her back into the nightmare she thought she had escaped. Her fingers curled tightly around the letter, her knuckles turning white. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run. But most of all, she wanted to protect her daughters. A soft knock at the door made her flinch. She inhaled sharply, forcing herself to stand. Her legs felt unsteady as she walked to the door and pulled it open. James stood there. He looked tired, as if he had spent the last few hours pacing, trying to figure out how to fix something that couldn't be fixed. His shirt was slightly wrinkled, his hair ruffled like he had been running his fingers through it repeatedly. But when he looked at her, his expression softened. "Come downstairs," he said quietly. She hesitated. "Why?" His jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained calm. "Because you're not facing this alone." She wanted to tell him that she had to face it alone, that she had spent her entire life fighting her own battles. But something in his eyes, something steady, something unshakable, made her nod. She turned, glancing at the bed where Ella and Sophie were curled up together, their tiny hands clasped as they slept. Their breathing was soft, rhythmic, completely unaware of the storm that was gathering outside the walls of their new home. She wished she could keep it that way. With a quiet exhale, she followed James out of the room. The study was dimly lit, the fire casting flickering shadows against the mahogany walls. James stood near his desk, his back straight, his hands resting on the surface as if he were preparing for war. A large, older man stood across from him, his expression unreadable. Charles Weston, James's father. Olivia's breath caught in her throat as the man turned to her, his gaze sweeping over her with the kind of quiet judgment she had grown used to. His suit was perfectly pressed, his posture unwavering, his expression calm, too calm, like he had already decided her fate. James exhaled sharply. "You should sit." She didn't. Instead, she crossed her arms over her chest, ignoring the way her heart pounded. "Just tell me what's going on." Charles let out a soft, measured sigh, like a man who had already lost his patience. "We received another letter." Her stomach twisted. James pushed a single envelope across the desk. This one had a name. She hesitated, staring at the paper as if it might burn her. Then, with trembling fingers, she picked it up. Her pulse roared in her ears as she unfolded it. "I'm coming for them. You can't hide them from me forever. Ryan." The room spun. She barely registered the sharp inhale of breath that came from her own lips. Her hands clenched around the letter, crumpling the edges, her nails digging into the paper. It wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. Charles cleared his throat, his voice calm, businesslike. "This situation is becoming dangerous, James, and dangerous situations require solutions." James shot him a glare. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Charles leaned forward, steepling his fingers together. "That she leaves." The words sliced through Olivia like a blade. She lifted her gaze sharply. "What?" Charles sighed. "Your presence here is a liability," he said smoothly. "If this Ryan character is determined enough, he will bring the kind of attention that the Weston family does not need." His eyes flickered toward James. "You are risking everything for a woman who—" James slammed his hand down on the desk. Charles barely flinched. "This isn't just a woman," James growled. "This is Olivia. And she is staying." Olivia swallowed hard, her body frozen in place. No one had ever fought for her before. No one. Charles's expression didn't change. "And what happens when this escalates? What happens when this man shows up at our doorstep? Will you still be playing the hero then?" James didn't even hesitate. "Yes." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Then, Charles let out another sigh, standing up from his chair. "Then you're on your own." James tensed. "What? You heard me." His father adjusted his cufflinks. "I won't let this family be dragged into your mess." James's jaw clenched, but his voice was calm when he said, "Then I don't need this family." Charles stiffened slightly. For the first time, a flicker of something, disbelief, maybe even pain, crossed his face. But it was gone in an instant. "Then that is your decision," he said simply. And with that, he walked out. The sound of the door clicking shut behind him sent a chill down Olivia's spine. James stood there for a moment, his shoulders tense, his fists clenched. Then, slowly, he exhaled and turned to her. "I meant what I said," he murmured. She stared at him, her heart hammering. He had just given up everything. For her. For Ella and Sophie. She felt her throat tighten. But before she could speak, James took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them. "I know you don't trust me yet," he said softly. "I know you think this is temporary. That I'll walk away when it gets hard." She swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. "But I won't," he continued. "I don't care what it takes. I will not let him take them." A tear slipped down her cheek. She turned away quickly, brushing it off. She had spent years surviving, fighting, being strong. She didn't know how to let someone else do it for her. But James was giving her a reason to believe again. And maybe, just maybe, she was willing to try. The walls of the Weston estate felt like they were closing in. Even though Olivia and her daughters had found warmth, safety, and food for the first time in years, she couldn't shake the heavy weight pressing against her chest. It was the same feeling she had carried every night on the streets, the fear that at any moment, everything could be ripped away. She had spent too long surviving to believe in happy endings. And as she stood outside the study, her heart hammering, she knew she was about to be reminded why. Through the partially open door, she could hear voices. James. And his father. She didn't need to see Charles Weston's face to know what kind of conversation was happening inside. She could hear it in his voice. Smooth and cold. A voice that belonged to a man who had built his empire by eliminating weaknesses. She was a weakness. She had known it from the moment she stepped foot in this house. From the way the butlers whispered. From the way the grand chandeliers and marble floors made her feel like an intruder in a world she didn't belong to. And Charles had been waiting for his moment to make that clear. She swallowed hard, pressing herself against the doorframe, her hands clenched into fists. "You've lost your mind," Charles said, his voice calm in the way that only men with absolute power could be. "You are gambling everything on a woman you barely know anymore." "I know enough," James answered, his tone steady, unshaken. "I know that she's not safe. That her daughters aren't safe. And I'm not going to turn my back on them." A soft, humorless laugh from Charles. "And what exactly do you think you're going to do? Play house? Become a father to 2 children that aren't yours? Take in a woman who has lived on the streets and pretend she can fit into our world?" Olivia flinched. She had known the words were coming. She had spent her entire life hearing them. From her own parents. From Ryan. From the strangers who had passed her by. Muttering under their breath as if her suffering was something she had chosen. But hearing them now, spoken with such cold certainty, still sent a sharp, familiar pain through her chest. Inside the room, there was silence. Then, James spoke, his voice quieter this time. "She doesn't need to fit into our world," he said. "That's not why she's here." Charles let out a slow sigh. "Then why is she here, James?" "Because she has nowhere else to go," James said. "Because no one else gave a damn whether she and her daughters lived or died. Because I did this to her." His voice wavered, just slightly, but enough for Olivia to hear the guilt that had been eating at him since the moment he found her on that street corner. Enough for her to realize that no matter how much she had tried to hate him, a part of him had been suffering, too. Charles scoffed. "So this is about your conscience? A way to redeem yourself? You think taking in some stray woman and her children is going to erase the past?" James's voice hardened. "Don't call her that." There was a sharp pause. Olivia sucked in a breath, gripping the doorframe tighter. James had always been the polished heir, the golden son, the man who lived his life playing by the rules set out for him. But now, she could hear something breaking inside him, something unraveling. And Charles knew it, too. "I see," Charles said after a moment, his voice eerily calm. "You actually think this is love?" Silence. Olivia's chest tightened. James didn't answer right away. And for some reason, that terrified her more than anything. Because she wanted to hear him say it. She wanted to hear him fight for her. For them. She had spent her whole life being something people walked away from. She wasn't sure she could survive it happening again. James let out a breath. "It doesn't matter what I think," he said. "What matters is that she needs help. And I'm not going to turn my back on her." Charles let out another soft, humorless chuckle. "You truly don't understand what you're doing, do you?" James said nothing. Charles sighed again, his voice lowering, the finality in it clear. "If you choose her," he said, "then you are no longer my son." The words hit like a gunshot. Olivia's breath caught in her throat. James was silent for so long that she thought maybe, just maybe, he was going to agree. That he was going to walk out of that office, find her in the hallway, and tell her that this had been a mistake, that she wasn't worth losing everything for. Her entire body tensed, bracing for it. But then, I guess I never was, James said. The quiet devastation in his voice was worse than any scream. Charles let out a short exhale, as if James had just proven his point. Then I won't waste my time trying to reason with you, he said simply. Leave this house. James didn't hesitate. Gladly. The door swung open so suddenly that Olivia barely had time to move back. James stepped out, his face unreadable, his jaw set, his entire body tense like he was trying to keep himself from completely falling apart. He turned to her. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She didn't know what to say. James had just given up everything. For her daughters, for the life they didn't even know if they could build together. But before she could even begin to process it, he exhaled, his shoulders slumping slightly as he raked a hand through his hair. Come on, he murmured, his voice quieter now, more exhausted. Let's go. She stared at him. Go where? He turned to her, and for the first time, she saw the cracks in him, the pain of losing everything. The uncertainty of what came next. The fear that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't going to choose him back. His voice was rough when he finally answered. Home. Her breath hitched. She had spent years searching for home, carrying it on her back, building it out of scraps for her daughters, telling herself that as long as they had each other, it was enough. But now, for the first time in her life, home didn't feel like something she had to build alone. It felt like someone she could build it with. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak. Okay. James exhaled, nodding once before stepping aside, waiting for her to follow. And this time, she did. Would you have walked away like James? What would you do if you had to choose between love and family? Let us know in the comments. If you believe Olivia and her daughters deserve happiness, hit the like button to support them. Subscribe for more powerful, emotional stories that remind us love is worth fighting for. Because sometimes, family isn't about blood, it's about who chooses to stay. The house was quiet, not the kind of eerie silence that signaled emptiness, but the kind that held warmth. The kind that made Olivia realize just how long she had gone without feeling truly safe. She sat on the edge of the massive bed, her hands resting on her lap, fingers intertwined as if she were trying to hold herself together. The events of the last few days played over and over in her mind, like echoes from a life that didn't feel real. James had given up everything for her. For them. She had spent years convincing herself that people didn't stay, that love wasn't real, that no one would ever look at her and see something worth keeping. But now, as she sat in the guest room of a house that no longer belonged to the Weston name, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The thought terrified her. Her daughters were asleep on the bed, curled up together, their small fingers clasped in a way that made her heart ache. They trusted her to keep them safe, to make the right choices. And yet, for the first time in a long time, she didn't know what the right choice was. James had chosen her, but could she choose him back? The past had taught her that love was fragile, that it was fleeting, that it never lasted. Ryan had whispered promises of forever, and then he had walked away. Her own parents had told her they would always love her, and then they had turned their backs when she needed them most. The world had taught her, over and over again, that she was easy to leave. So why should James be any different? A soft knock at the door made her jump. She inhaled sharply, pressing her palms against her lap, trying to steady herself. Come in. The door opened, and James stepped inside. His sleeves were rolled up, his shirt slightly wrinkled, his hair disheveled like he had spent hours running his hands through it. He looked exhausted, but when he looked at her, his expression softened. I figured you'd still be awake, he said quietly. She nodded, but didn't speak. He hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer, sitting on the chair across from her. The space between them felt both too small and too vast. A chasm of words neither of them knew how to say. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, James exhaled, leaning forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. You don't have to stay, he said. Her breath caught. I mean it, he continued. I didn't bring you here to trap you. I didn't do any of this because I expect something from you. His voice was quiet, but firm. I just wanted you to have a choice. She stared at him. A choice. No one had ever given her one before. Ryan had decided for her that she wasn't worth staying for. Her parents had decided for her that she wasn't worth fighting for. The world had decided for her that she wasn't worth saving. But James was giving her a choice. And for some reason, that made her want to cry. She swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. "You don't even know me anymore," she whispered. "You think you do, but you don't." James didn't flinch. "Then let me." She let out a shaky breath. "I'm not the girl you loved. James, I'm not soft. I'm not hopeful. I don't believe in fairy tales." His lips twitched slightly. "Good," he said, "because I don't believe in fairy tales either." He leaned forward, his voice lowering. "But I believe in you." Her throat tightened. James exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "You don't have to love me back. Olivia, you don't have to feel anything for me. But you do have to let yourself believe that you deserve this." She stared at him, her pulse roaring in her ears. Deserve this. Deserve safety. Deserve happiness. Deserve love. She had spent years believing the opposite. But now, sitting here, with James looking at her like she was something worth choosing, something worth sacrificing for, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong. Her fingers curled into fists, nails pressing into her palms. "I don't know how to do this." James's expression didn't waver. "Then we figure it out together." Her chest ached. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to. But her voice was small when she finally whispered, "What if I don't know how to stop running?" James's gaze softened. He reached out then, hesitating for just a second before his fingers brushed against hers. He didn't pull her into his arms. He didn't try to convince her with words. He just held on. And for the first time in years, she let someone hold on to her. A single tear slipped down her cheek. James reached up, brushing it away with the pad of his thumb. His touch was soft, careful, like he was afraid she might shatter. But she had already shattered. Years ago. Now, she just needed to learn how to piece herself back together. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to do it alone. She inhaled sharply, blinking up at him. "Okay." James's lips parted slightly. "Okay?" She swallowed. "Okay." A slow, relieved breath left his lungs. And he nodded. It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't a promise of forever. But it was something. And for now, that was enough. The morning light filtered softly through the sheer curtains, casting golden streaks across the room. It was the kind of morning Olivia Reed had only dreamed of, one where she wasn't waking up to the harsh bite of cold air, the gnawing pain of hunger, or the crippling fear of what the day would bring. For the first time in years, she woke up in a warm bed. And for the first time in even longer, she wasn't alone. Sophie and Ella were curled up beside her, their small bodies tangled in the soft blankets, their faces peaceful. The sight of them like this, safe, comfortable, made something deep in Olivia's chest ache. This was what she had fought for. This was what she had dreamed of. Not the mansion, not the luxury, not the impossibly soft bed beneath her. Just this, just her daughters, sleeping soundly without fear. She reached out, brushing a loose curl from Ella's face. Her daughter stirred slightly but didn't wake, letting out a soft sigh before nestling deeper into the pillows. Olivia swallowed past the lump in her throat. They had been through so much. She had spent years telling herself that as long as she had them, as long as she could protect them, it didn't matter if she suffered. It didn't matter if she was exhausted, starving, or scared. They had needed her to be strong. But for the first time in years, she didn't have to fight alone. A quiet knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She hesitated before slipping out of bed carefully, tucking the blankets around her daughters, then making her way toward the door. She knew who it was before she even opened it. James. He stood there, looking slightly hesitant, his hair tousled like he had been running his fingers through it. His usual polished appearance slightly undone. It suited him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, James held up 2 steaming mugs. "Coffee?" Olivia blinked, caught off guard by how normal this felt. How right it felt. She hesitated, then stepped aside, letting him in. James moved carefully, setting the mugs down on the small table near the window before turning to her. "I wasn't sure how you liked it," he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "So I guessed." Olivia let out a soft, breathless laugh, the first real laugh she had allowed herself in a long time. James stilled at the sound, like he wasn't sure if he had imagined it. Then, slowly, he smiled. and something in Olivia's chest loosened. She stepped forward, picking up one of the mugs. The warmth seeped into her fingers, grounding her. "Thank you," she murmured. James nodded, watching her carefully. "How are you feeling?" She let out a slow breath, wrapping both hands around the mug. "Like I don't know how to be here," she admitted. James didn't look surprised. "I get that," he said softly. "It's a lot." She glanced toward the bed, where her daughters were still sleeping. "They don't know any of this," she whispered. "They don't know about the threats. About Ryan. They think this is just a nice place we get to stay for a while." James nodded slowly. "Do you want to tell them?" She exhaled sharply. "I don't know." She had spent their entire lives shielding them from the worst of it, keeping the weight of their reality off their small shoulders. But now, as much as she wanted to protect them, she knew she couldn't keep running forever. James stepped closer. "Whatever you decide, I'll support it." She looked up at him, and the weight of everything hit her all at once. This man had given up his name, his wealth, his family, everything he had ever known, just to make sure she and her daughters were safe. He had stood by her when no one else had. He had chosen her, and yet, the fear still clung to her. Because she had spent her whole life being abandoned, and part of her still believed it would happen again. James must have sensed her hesitation because he reached out, taking the mug from her hands and setting it down before gently gripping her fingers. "I know this isn't easy," he said quietly. "I know trusting me isn't easy." She swallowed hard, her fingers trembling slightly in his grasp. "But I'm not going anywhere. Olivia." His voice was steady, unshaken. "Not today, not tomorrow, not ever." Her breath hitched. For years, she had been surviving. For years, she had been running. But maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to anymore. She let out a slow, shaky breath. "Okay," she whispered. James's grip tightened slightly, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "Okay?" She nodded. And then, for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe. To believe that maybe love wasn't something that always ended in heartbreak. To believe that maybe she wasn't impossible to love. To believe that maybe, just maybe, home wasn't a place. It was a person. What do you think? Can Olivia finally trust and love again? Should she take this second chance? Let us know in the comments. If you believe Olivia and her daughters deserve happiness, hit the like button to show your support. Subscribe for more emotional, heartwarming stories that remind us that love, hope, and second chances are always possible. Because sometimes, the hardest thing to do isn't surviving. It's learning how to stop running.